Just 1 month after the Black Lives Matter riots started in the summer of 2020, the Associated Press announced that they would start capitalizing the word black when talking about black people or the black community in any story that used the word, since they were now considering it a proper noun, which are capitalized, like people's names and the names of cities and buildings. And people couldn't help but notice that after they started doing that, they left the word white with a lowercase w whenever talking about white people. Then they issued a statement saying that they were not going to capitalize the W in white people because, quote, white people in general have much less shared history and culture and don't have the experience of being discriminated against because of skin color. This, of course, is just another example of anti-white racism or anti-whiteism, which every white person in America has felt steadily increasing over the last few years, coinciding with the spread of Marxism. Something I detail in my new book, The War on Conservatives, because there's only so much I can get into here on YouTube. So order the book in paperback from Amazon.com by clicking the link in the description below. An assistant professor of political science at Duke University named Ashley Jardina has actually been a pioneer in scholarly research into the emergence of what's called white identity or white identity politics, meaning white people starting to think about themselves as an ethnic group like blacks, Latinos, and every other race, and caring about their interest and admitting that it's okay to care about their interests in a multicultural society instead of always being pushed aside in the name of diversity. She found that contrary to most people's expectations and beliefs, there is a low correlation between white identity and racial resentment towards other races. In other words, white people who are racially conscious and are thinking of themselves and other white people as part of an ethnic group are not racist against non-whites. They simply want what every other racial group in America has, which is the right to not only be proud of their race, but to be able to voice their support for their own in-group interests and to work to maintain them. White identity is totally different from white supremacy or white nationalism, although the Democrats and the liberal media deceptively conflate them as if they're one and the same.
So tell me a bit about the lack of correlation you found between racial resentment and white identification.
Yeah, this is something that I think people often find quite surprising. Part of it is the sort of motivation to wonder about the difference between white identity and racial attitudes. And I think a lot of people suspect that if you have a high level of white identity, then you probably do also have a high level of or high degree of racial resentment. And for those of you out there who are thinking about correlations, the correlation actually between white identity and racial resentment is only about 0.13, just a very small correlation. And part of the reason for that is that there are many whites who score high on this racial resentment scale. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the theory of racial resentment, the measure is attempting to capture this combination of anti-Black affect and the belief that Blacks in the United States do not subscribe to traditional American values like hard work. And so the scale is comprised of questions like, do you agree or disagree with the idea that the Irish, Italians, and Jews had to work their way up without special favors and Blacks should do the same? Or do you agree or disagree that generations of slavery have made it difficult for Blacks to get ahead? And it turns out that most white Americans in the United States score at the midpoint or above on that scale. Most whites in the United States are what we would call to some degree racially resentful. And it's because there are many whites who possess their sort of moderate to high level of of racial resentment who also do not necessarily think of themselves as being white or don't possess a high level of white identity. And then the converse is true. There are a lot of whites who score high in white identity who aren't necessarily especially high in racial resentment. We don't therefore observe a strong correlation between those two. And I think part of it just kind of goes back to conceptually the idea that there are many whites in the United States who are worried about their group. They're worried about their loss of status, their loss of privilege, but that concern isn't necessarily coupled with a sense of hostility or animosity or dislike of people of color.
And in her book, White Identity Politics, Ashley Jardina notes that as white people increasingly become a minority in the United States, estimated to occur around the year 2045, this is going to awaken, she says, a white identity movement. She points out in her book, which is terribly dry and boring, written really for academics and scholars, not the general public, that the more white people feel under attack just for being white, the more that is going to accelerate their racial consciousness, which had previously been mostly invisible, like fish in water, because white people usually never think about themselves in terms of a racial group, because whiteness has been the dominant culture in America since its founding. That, however, as we all know, is rapidly changing. After the Black Lives Matter riots in the summer of 2020, the entire liberal media industrial complex, Fortune 500 companies, sports teams, celebrities, and even video game companies started endlessly praising Black Lives Matter, donating millions of dollars to black causes, bending over backwards to praise black people, and launch campaigns to do things like steadily increase the number of black people in television commercials. And soon white people all but disappeared. Black people, who make up 13% of the population, now seem to make up about 97% of the people in television commercials. When I posted on Facebook asking if anyone else felt like they were watching BET during the commercial breaks on TV now, even on Fox News, the post got over 30,000 likes and more than 10,000 comments from people who were also noticing the obvious. But like the frog boiling in the proverbial pot, it was a slow and steady change, not all of a sudden. So it wasn't noticeable at first, but eventually everyone began to see the change. Shortly after my Facebook post, actor Kevin Sorbo tweeted, quote, "Is it just me, or have you also noticed that television commercials in the last 2 years have had major casting changes?" Everyone had noticed, but few were afraid to say anything about it because they don't want to be called racist. Kevin Sorbo was obviously dancing around what he was really thinking in his tweet, but Joe Biden noticed too, and without a filter, said the quiet part out loud.
Just look at the money being spent on advertising. Did you ever 5 years ago think every second or third ad out of 5 or 6 you'd turn on would be biracial couples? I challenge you, find today, when you turn on the stations, sit on one station for 2 hours, and I don't know how many commercials you'll see. Lay 8 to 5. 2 to 3 out of 5 have mixed race couples in them. That's not by accident.
It's quite obvious the whole fair representation in media thing had gone off the rails, and the pandering to diversity resulted in black people being dramatically overrepresented in television commercials. Of course, just noticing this and saying something about it, other than it's fantastic, is considered to be racist. But then again, we're living in an era where pretty much anything white people do, other than apologize for their existence or cater to the cultural Marxist agenda, is deemed problematic. When black people complain about white people in general, the liberal establishment embraces their criticism as necessary and frames it as if it's an important issue that white people need to address, no matter how wildly inaccurate or exaggerated their claims are. But when whites simply point out basic facts about the black community in America, such as black men make up only about 6.5% of the US population, but commit almost half of all violent crime, or that most black children don't have a father in the home, then those facts are labeled racist, no matter the context or the purpose of pointing them out. As a result of the growing anti-whiteism on college campuses and on social media, a few years ago now, some creative members of 4chan, the online messaging board, decided to print flyers that simply read, "It's okay to be white," and posted them around various schools to see how others would react. And as you can imagine, instead of ignoring the flyers or agreeing with such an innocuous statement, they made national headlines and were denounced as racist, which proved the very point those who posted them were trying to make. The Washington Post reported that the flyers were found on over half a dozen schools across the country and that the schools were investigating the incidents. They even made the local news in various cities from people freaking out about them.
Tonight, the NAACP is calling on administrators at Florida Gulf Coast University to do something about a new sign posted on campus that says, "It's okay to be white."
Concern and confusion at UC Davis over racially charged flyers posted on campus. it causes a lot of tension and a lot of like defensiveness.
Well, Griffin Baker Royo is still awaiting tonight to hear if he'll be punished or not by the university for putting up those posters that read, "It's okay to be white." He hasn't been criminally charged, but we do know that he's been referred to student affairs here at the university.
The Southern Poverty Law Center and the ADL declared that the phrase, "It's okay to be white," is a white supremacist slogan. There's even a Wikipedia page dedicated to it. The backlash to such a harmless statement proves that there is a war being waged against white people in America today, and those daring to just disagree with the rampant anti-white agenda are labeled white supremacists and cited as more evidence of the problem with whiteness. Perhaps it's time for a new leafleting or poster campaign using innocuous flyers on college campuses or other public places that simply say, "Black people can be racist too." I'm not suggesting that you do that because you'll probably get expelled and labeled a Nazi by CNN, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the ADL if there's any security cameras that capture footage of you doing it. But if it were done on Halloween when you're wearing a costume and couldn't be identified, it might be fun to put up some. If you're someone like Nick Cannon, host of an MTV sketch comedy and game show called Wild and Out, then you're allowed to spew anti-whiteism with no consequences. He has a podcast and he made headlines for some anti-Semitic views he holds, like the delusion that black people are supposedly the real Jews, a completely absurd idea held in fringe black supremacist circles like the Black Hebrew Israelites. But on the same podcast that got him in trouble for that, he also made some shocking anti-white comments about how he thinks that white people are subhuman compared to blacks because white people don't have melanin in their skin and all this crazy stuff. But that wasn't the problem. He wasn't fired by MTV for anti-whiteism because anti-white racism is allowed and encouraged in America today. It was the other stuff. But because of his black privilege, he was hired back by MTV 6 months later and was allowed to go on with his career as if nothing happened and everyone forgot about the whole thing. Listen, obviously behind the jokes, sarcasm, and voiceovers of Brian Stelter, who is sadly missed, I'm actually a very serious person. I'm kind of a big nerd actually, but a spoonful of comedy helps the medicine go down. And if you like my serious monologues like this, then you'll really love reading my books. So order The War on Conservatives in paperback from Amazon.com and get an extra copy for someone for Christmas, which is just around the corner, by clicking the link in the description below and checking it out.